My wife had called me 4 times in one afternoon, and I hadn't answered a single one. I was on the road between Memphis and home, hands-free turned off because I was running a recorded consultation with a client. By the time I pulled over and listened to her voicemails, the last one wasn't from her at all. It was from a woman named Yvonne at First Federal Savings on Clarksville Pike, and she said 7 words that changed everything. "Mr. Mercer, you need to come home." 2 hours later, I was sitting at our kitchen table looking at a bank withdrawal slip for $40,000, signed in my wife's handwriting, and I knew the signature was hers, but the decision never was. The drive from Memphis back to Nashville had felt ordinary. October in Tennessee turns the hills amber and rust, and I'd been thinking about stopping for gas station coffee somewhere past Jackson when my phone finally had reception again and the voicemails came through in a cluster. Carol's first 3 messages were gentle, the way she always called when something was quietly wrong. She didn't like to alarm me. 38 years of marriage, and she still softened the edges of bad news before I arrived. The 4th message, Yvonne's message, had none of that softness. Her voice was careful in the way people get careful when they've seen something they shouldn't have seen and can't unsee it. I called her back before I called Carol. Yvonne told me she was a personal banker at the branch near our house, that she'd known Carol for 11 years, that Carol came in regularly to deposit her pension checks, and they always talked for a few minutes about her garden and her grandchildren. She said that 3 days ago, Carol had come in with my brother and his wife, and they had assisted her in completing a cash withdrawal of $40,000 from our joint savings account. She said Carol had seemed confused at certain points during the transaction, had asked twice what the money was for, and that my brother had answered for her both times, saying it was a home renovation loan they were giving to us and that Carol understood everything perfectly. Yvonne said she'd processed the transaction because it was legal and Carol had signed everything and her ID was valid. Then she said the part that made me pull off the highway completely. She said that after the transaction, while my brother was walking Carol to the car, Carol had turned back to the window and said quietly, almost to herself, that she hoped Harold wouldn't be too upset about the kitchen remodel. There was no kitchen remodel. We hadn't discussed any kitchen remodel, and the money had not gone into our account. It had left ours entirely. I sat on the shoulder of I-40 for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because I watched the clock on the dashboard without seeing it. Then I started the car and drove straight home without stopping. Carol was in the living room when I got there, watching the evening news with the volume too low, the way she'd been doing lately. She looked up when I came in and smiled the same smile she'd given me for 4 decades. And I sat down next to her and took her hand, and I asked her very gently about the bank visit. She remembered going. She remembered Dennis and Pamela picking her up. She remembered signing papers. But when I asked what the papers were for, she looked at the window for a long moment and said she thought it was something about helping with the house. I asked which house, ours or theirs. She wasn't sure. She said Dennis had explained everything, and it had made sense at the time. I didn't push. I kissed her on the forehead, told her I was glad to be home, and went to my study and closed the door. I spent 31 years investigating insurance fraud before I retired. I'd worked for 2 of the largest carriers in the Southeast, and before that, I'd consulted for a law firm in Atlanta on financial crimes. I knew what financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult looked like. I'd seen it in claim documents, in forged signatures, in the particular way that financial abuse leaves a paper trail that the abuser never thinks to clean up, because they believe the victim can't articulate what happened. I had testified in 11 criminal cases involving elder financial fraud. I had never once imagined I would be building one of those cases in my own home against my own brother. Dennis was 4 years younger than me. We had grown up in Dixon County, had shared a bedroom until I left for college, had been close in the way brothers are close when they're the only 2 children in a house where money was always tight. He had called me 3 weeks ago just to chat, which I'd thought nothing of. He had visited Carol twice in September while I was traveling for work, which I had been grateful for because Carol had been having some difficult days, and I didn't like leaving her alone for extended stretches. I sat at my desk and began writing down everything Yvonne had told me. Dates, amounts, names, sequence of events, 31 years of habit. The next morning I called Dennis. He answered on the second ring, voice easy and warm, asking how Memphis had gone. I told him fine. I told him I'd seen Carol's bank statement. I kept my voice completely neutral, the same tone I'd used in hundreds of fraud interviews when I wanted the other person to believe we were just having a conversation. He paused for a fraction of a second. Not long, but I'd been listening for it. He told me the same thing he'd told Yvonne, that he and Pamela had decided to loan Carol and me money for a kitchen renovation, that Carol had been talking about updating the countertops for months and he'd wanted to do something nice for us, that the $40,000 would be paid back whenever we were ready. He said he'd spoken to Carol about it several times, and she had been enthusiastic. He said he was sorry he hadn't mentioned it to me directly, that it was supposed to be a surprise. I thanked him for being generous and told him I'd be in touch about the renovation timeline. After I hung up, I drove to the bank and asked to speak to the branch manager. I brought the withdrawal slip Yvonne had given me, and I asked for a complete transaction history for the previous 18 months. What I found when I sat down with those records in the manager's office changed the shape of everything I thought I understood. The $40,000 was not the first withdrawal. 8 months earlier, $12,000 had left our savings and gone to an account I didn't recognize. 6 months before that, $8,500. Both transactions had occurred on weekdays when I was traveling for consulting work. Both had Carol's signature. The branch manager pulled the security footage for the most recent transaction, and we watched my brother guide my wife to the window with his hand at the small of her back, watched Pamela stand slightly behind Carol's left shoulder the entire time, watched Carol sign, and then look up at Dennis with an expression I recognized immediately. It was the expression she used when she was trying to remember something she felt she should already know. I drove home and called my doctor. Carol had a neurological evaluation scheduled for December, something we'd been putting off, something I'd been quietly not naming, even as the signs had been accumulating for nearly a year. I moved the appointment to that Friday. The diagnosis was mild cognitive impairment, with early indicators consistent with Alzheimer's. The neurologist, a careful woman named Dr. Patel, explained that Carol's condition would have been present and progressing for some time before becoming noticeable in daily interactions. She said that, in her current state, Carol was capable of carrying on normal conversations, of appearing entirely coherent to someone who didn't know her well, but that her ability to fully evaluate complex decisions, to retain context within a single conversation, to distinguish between what she genuinely wanted and what she was being guided toward, was meaningfully compromised. I sat in the parking lot of the medical center for 20 minutes before driving home. That evening, I called an old colleague from my fraud investigation years, a man named Dave Ingram, who had retired from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and now ran a private practice out of Franklin. I told him I needed financial records pulled on my brother, specifically gambling records, debt accounts, and any legal filings in the past 2 years. Dave asked me if I was sure. I told him I was sure. While Dave worked, I hired a Nashville attorney named Patricia Connolly, who specialized in elder financial abuse litigation. She had a small office near Vanderbilt and a reputation that made opposing counsel uncomfortable. Our first meeting lasted 2 hours. I brought every document I had, the withdrawal slips, the transaction history, the security footage disk from the bank. She reviewed everything quietly, and then told me that what I was describing was textbook financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a Class C felony in Tennessee, and that the premeditated nature of it, the pattern across multiple transactions, the specific timing to coincide with my absence, was going to matter enormously to a prosecutor. She asked me what outcome I wanted. I told her I wanted every dollar back, and I wanted my brother held criminally accountable. She nodded and told me those goals were not contradictory. Dave's report came 4 days later. I read it at my desk with a cup of coffee that went cold beside me. Dennis had accumulated $94,000 in personal loan debt across 3 lending institutions. He had opened and closed 4 credit card accounts in the past 18 months, each one maxed and then surrendered. His contracting business, a small residential remodeling company he'd run for 15 years, had filed for a payment extension with the IRS twice in the past year. Pamela had stopped working 18 months ago, right around the time of the first unauthorized withdrawal from our account. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage. Dave had also found something else. 3 months before the first withdrawal, Dennis had requested a copy of my life insurance policy beneficiary designations from the company I'd used for 30 years. He had claimed to be calling as my authorized representative. The company had declined to provide the information without written authorization from me, but the request had been logged. I called Patricia and read her the report over the phone. She was quiet for a moment, then said that this changed the scope of what we were looking at. The insurance inquiry suggested Dennis had been surveying our entire financial picture, not just the accessible bank accounts. She asked if Carol and I had a will, a power of attorney document, any estate planning instruments. I told her we did. She asked if those documents were stored anywhere Dennis would have had access. I said no. They were in a fireproof safe in my study. Then she asked if I was certain the documents in that safe were the originals and that they hadn't been altered. I had never considered that question. I had not considered it because it had not occurred to me that it needed to be considered. I drove to my study, opened the safe, and called our estate attorney, a man named Gerald Watkins, who drafted our documents 7 years ago. I read him the relevant sections over the phone while he pulled up his own records. Everything matched. Nothing had been changed. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in a week. The following Tuesday, I called Dennis and told him I needed to see him in person. I said it calmly, said I had some questions about the finances I wanted to work through face to face. He agreed to come over Thursday. I told Patricia, who told me not to ask him anything specific during the visit, just to observe, to let him establish his narrative on his own terms. She said we needed him comfortable before we filed anything. He arrived with Pamela, which I hadn't expected. She sat at our kitchen table across from Dennis and held her coffee cup with both hands and didn't say much. Dennis was relaxed in a way that looked practiced. He talked about the renovation, asked Carol what colors she'd been considering for the countertops, and Carol smiled and said she wasn't sure, maybe something lighter, and Dennis told her she had great taste. I watched him the entire time. I watched him look at my wife with the ease of a man who had decided she would not remember what he'd taken from her. I got up to refill the coffee, and while I stood at the counter with my back to the table, I heard Pamela say something quietly to Dennis that I almost missed. She said, "Did you bring the other thing?" And Dennis said, also quietly, "Not yet. Later." I turned around with the coffee pot and asked what they were talking about. Dennis said Pamela had wanted to show Carol a tile sample she'd brought for the renovation. Pamela nodded. There was no tile sample. Neither of them produced one. After they left, I called Patricia. I told her about the exchange. She said to give her 48 hours. Patricia filed the civil complaint on a Monday morning. Breach of fiduciary duty, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraudulent conversion. The compensatory damages sought were $60,500, the full amount of the unauthorized withdrawals plus interest. The punitive damages sought were $300,000. Patricia explained that Tennessee law allowed for treble damages in elder exploitation cases, and she intended to pursue the maximum. Dennis called me that afternoon from a number I didn't recognize, which told me he'd seen the process server's visit and didn't want the call logged on his regular phone. He didn't scream. That surprised me. His voice was controlled in a way that I knew from experience meant the anger was deep rather than reactive. He said that he could not believe I would do this to my own family, that the money had been a loan, that Carol had understood completely, that I was dragging all of us through a legal nightmare over a misunderstanding. He said that Carol had asked him for help, and he had provided it, and this was how he was being thanked. I asked him one question. I asked why. If the money was a loan, it had not gone into our account. He said there had been a miscommunication with the renovation contractor about account numbers, that it would be corrected. I told him Patricia handled all further communication and ended the call. 2 days later, my phone started ringing with calls from people I hadn't spoken to in months. My cousin Raymond in Knoxville called to say he'd heard there was trouble between Dennis and me and hoped it could be worked out. A man from our church, named Bill, who had known Dennis since they'd served on the same committee together, called and said family disputes could get complicated and maybe a mediator could help. Each call was careful, measured, sympathetic on the surface. Dennis had been making his own calls. The narrative he was building was this: that Carol had been deteriorating for some time, and I hadn't been paying attention, that I'd been absent traveling while she struggled at home, and Dennis had stepped in to help manage her affairs with her full knowledge and consent, and now I was punishing him for it with a lawsuit I was pursuing out of guilt and grief over my wife's condition. It was a story designed to make me the negligent husband and him the devoted brother. I heard the same version of it in slightly different forms across several of those phone calls. By the time the third person suggested I consider whether I was seeing the situation clearly, I recognized the coordination. The week that followed was the hardest one. Not because I doubted the evidence, the withdrawal slips and the security footage and the timeline didn't change, but because doubt has a way of entering through the people who care about you rather than through the facts themselves. My son called from Denver, careful and quiet, saying he'd talked to Uncle Dennis and just wanted to hear my side. My daughter-in-law forwarded me an article about how financial disagreements in families could be resolved through mediation rather than courts. Each message was gentle and well-intentioned, and each one landed like a small stone placed on my chest. Carol asked me one evening what was happening with Dennis. She had heard me on the phone and sensed something wrong, the way she always had, even now. I sat with her and told her the truth as plainly as I could. I told her that Dennis had taken money from our account without my knowledge, and that I was working to get it back. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I thought something felt wrong when we were at the bank." She said it without drama, just a clear factual statement from somewhere underneath the fog that had been gathering in her for months. I remember thinking, I should wait for you. I should have waited for you. I took her hand and held it. "You didn't do anything wrong," I said. "No," she said, "but I should have waited for you." I went to my study that night and I did not doubt myself again. The deposition of Yvonne happened on a Wednesday in Patricia's conference room. Yvonne arrived with her own counsel, a cautious young attorney who'd advised her on the limits of her professional obligations. She was steady and precise. She described every detail of the transaction exactly as she'd told me on the phone, and she added something she hadn't mentioned before because I hadn't thought to ask. She said that during the transaction, she had leaned over the counter and quietly asked Carol, just Carol, without Dennis or Pamela hearing, whether she felt comfortable with what she was signing. And Carol had looked at her and said she thought so, and then looked at Dennis across the lobby and said she was pretty sure Dennis had explained everything. Yvonne had noted in her transaction log that the customer had appeared to defer to accompanying parties on multiple occasions during the visit. That log note became part of the civil record. Dave called me the same week with a secondary finding. Dennis had made 3 calls in the 2 months before the first withdrawal to a specialized elder law attorney in Brentwood, an attorney who had not taken him as a client but whose office had confirmed the inquiry when Patricia subpoenaed their intake records. The calls had been about power of attorney modification procedures and the legal requirements for establishing financial guardianship over a cognitively impaired spouse on behalf of a concerned family member. He had researched how to take control before he had taken the money. Patricia took that information to the district attorney's office along with the rest of the civil case file. She had a contact there, a prosecutor named Marcus Hale, who handled financial crimes against the elderly. Hale reviewed the file over a weekend and called Patricia on Monday morning with the news that he was opening a criminal investigation. The bank records, the security footage, the pattern of withdrawals, the insurance inquiry, and the deposition from Yvonne gave him what he needed to move forward. Dennis and Pamela didn't know any of this yet. The civil process had been producing its own pressure. Patricia had filed a motion to freeze their accounts and prevent asset transfers during the litigation. The judge, a methodical woman named Judge Holbrook, reviewed the financial evidence Patricia presented and granted the motion within 5 days. Dennis and Pamela were frozen. The mortgage they couldn't pay couldn't be refinanced. The debts they'd been moving between accounts couldn't be restructured. Dennis retained an attorney, a former public defender named Craig Bowen, who had built a practice on aggressive pretrial positioning. His strategy revealed itself within a week of his appointment. He gave a phone interview to a local news outlet covering the story in which he described his client as a devoted brother doing his best to care for a sister-in-law with a serious medical condition, while her husband traveled for work only to be blindsided by a lawsuit that would devastate a family already struggling. He used the word vindictive twice. He used the phrase weaponizing the legal system once. I read the article over coffee without commenting on it to Carol. The calls from relatives and friends slowed and then stopped entirely, which was its own kind of answer. Either they'd received the same article and were waiting to see how the situation developed, or they'd chosen a side and weren't going to tell me which one. I stopped expecting the phone to ring with support and focused on what I could control. Patricia's discovery process had generated a request for Dennis's personal financial records, phone logs, and all communications, referencing Carol or me in the 18 months preceding the lawsuit. Bowen fought the request aggressively, filing 2 separate motions to limit the scope of discovery. He lost both. The records arrived in Patricia's office in banker's boxes, and Dave Ingram spent 4 days going through them with her paralegal. What they found demolished the renovation loan narrative completely. In the month before the first withdrawal, Dennis had exchanged 43 text messages with Pamela about what they referred to as the account situation and the H situation, H being me. The texts discussed my travel schedule in detail, specifically the weeks I would be in Atlanta, Memphis, and Huntsville over the following 3 months. One message from Dennis to Pamela read, "If we're going to do this, we need to do it when he's on the road because he checks the statements." Another, sent the day before the first withdrawal, read simply, "Confirmed tomorrow." She agreed. There was no message about renovation contractors, no mention of countertops, no discussion of home improvement of any kind. On the morning of the first withdrawal, Dennis had texted Pamela from the bank parking lot. "She doesn't really know what she's signing, but she's doing it. Told her H approved it. I had not approved it. I was in Atlanta that day." The criminal charges came down on a Thursday morning, 4 months after I'd first listened to Yvonne's voicemail on the shoulder of I-40. 2 counts of financial exploitation of an elderly or vulnerable adult. 1 count of theft over $10,000. 1 count of fraud by deception. Each charge carried its own sentencing range. Added together, Dennis was looking at a possible 12 to 15 years. Detective Caldwell called me personally to let me know the warrants had been executed. Dennis was taken into custody at his home at 7 in the morning. Pamela was arrested separately, as she had been named in both the conspiracy and the fraud counts given her direct participation in the transactions. Carol was in the kitchen making tea when I came in from the call. She looked at my face and set the kettle down. "Is it over?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "But it's going the right direction." She nodded and poured the tea and handed me a cup and didn't say anything else. And I thought about how much she had weathered in her life, how much she had absorbed quietly and continued forward, and I decided that whatever came next, I would not let her face a single part of it alone. Bail was set at $150,000 for Dennis and $80,000 for Pamela. Their accounts were frozen by both the civil case and the criminal proceeding simultaneously, which meant they couldn't access the funds they needed to post bond. They remained in custody for 6 days, while their families scrambled to piece together the collateral. Dennis's oldest daughter, a woman I had known since she was 7 years old, called me during those 6 days and asked if there was anything I could do. I told her gently that there was not, that what happened next was between her father and the court, and that I was sorry she was in the middle of it. It was the hardest phone call I made throughout the entire ordeal. Bowen's strategy shifted after the criminal charges. The civil narrative about the devoted brother was harder to maintain now that the text messages were in the record, so he pivoted to a new approach. He filed a countermotion in the civil case, arguing that Carol had been a capable adult at the time of the transactions, that the cognitive impairment diagnosis came months after the fact, and that Dennis had acted in good faith based on his understanding of his sister-in-law's wishes. He hired a neuropsychologist to review Carol's medical records and produce a report suggesting her impairment may have been less severe at the time of the earlier transactions than her subsequent diagnosis indicated. Patricia had anticipated this. She had already retained Dr. Patel, Carol's own neurologist, who provided a declaration explaining that mild cognitive impairment of the type Carol displayed typically presents and progresses over a period of 18 to 24 months before formal diagnosis, and that the behaviors Yvonne had described during the transaction, the deference to others, the twice-repeated question about the purpose of the withdrawal, were consistent with cognitive vulnerability that would have been present well before the December evaluation. The neuropsychologist Bowen hired reviewed the same records and produced a report that was substantively less definitive than he'd apparently promised. During his deposition, he acknowledged under Patricia's questioning that he could not rule out significant cognitive vulnerability at the time of the transactions, and that his report had been based on limited available data. Bowen withdrew the countermotion 2 weeks later. November brought a development I hadn't expected. Pamela's attorney, a woman she'd retained separately from Dennis after their interests began to diverge, reached out to Marcus Hale's office with a proffer. Pamela was willing to provide a full account of the planning and execution of the withdrawals in exchange for reduced charges. She would testify that the scheme had originated with Dennis, that he had presented it to her as a temporary measure to address their debt crisis, that he had convinced her Carol wouldn't remember clearly enough to contradict the renovation story, and that she had accompanied him to the bank primarily because he hadn't wanted to go alone. She also told Hale something that had not appeared in the text messages or the bank records. She said that 2 months before the first withdrawal, Dennis had driven out to our house on a Saturday afternoon when I was in Huntsville for work. Carol had let him in. He had sat with Carol in the living room and had gently, persistently, asked her questions about our finances, about the savings account balances, about my life insurance policy, about whether I had any accounts she didn't know about. He had told Carol he was asking because he was worried about us, wanted to make sure we were planning properly. Carol had answered his questions openly, the way she would answer questions from someone she'd trusted her entire adult life. Pamela said Dennis had come home that afternoon and written down everything Carol had told him. I read Hale's summary of her proffer in Patricia's office on a gray Tuesday morning, and I sat with it for a long moment. The deliberateness of it, the patience. Driving out there on a Saturday, sitting across from my wife, asking her careful questions, writing down the answers. My brother had surveyed Carol like a property he was planning to acquire. Patricia asked if I was all right. I told her to keep going. Pamela's cooperation fundamentally altered the criminal proceeding. The prosecution now had an eyewitness to the planning phase, corroborated by the text messages and financial records already in evidence. Bowen recognized the shift. He began requesting meetings with Hale's office, and by mid-December he had negotiated a plea agreement for Dennis. 2 counts of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, guilty. The theft and fraud charges were dropped. Sentencing guidelines placed Dennis at 4 to 6 years in state prison, with the possibility of early release after 3. Dennis appeared in court for the plea on a Thursday morning in December. I sat in the courtroom with Patricia beside me. Carol had not come, at my request. There were things she did not need to see, and this was one of them. Dennis was thinner than the last time I'd seen him. The 6 days in custody and the months of proceedings having reduced something in him that I couldn't name precisely. He stood at the defendant's table and answered the judge's questions in a flat, careful voice, and pled guilty to both counts without looking at the gallery. The judge scheduled sentencing for January. The civil case resolved 2 weeks after the criminal plea, the guilty plea serving as the foundation for liability. Judge Holbrook awarded full compensatory damages of $60,500, plus statutory treble damages under Tennessee's Adult Protection Act. The total civil judgment was just under $200,000. Dennis and Pamela had declared bankruptcy the previous month. The house was in foreclosure. Every account was empty. The judgment attached to any future assets, any inheritance, any income above a minimum threshold, for as long as it remained unsatisfied, which under Tennessee law meant indefinitely. Patricia told me afterward, walking down the courthouse steps in the January cold, that we would likely collect very little of it in the near term. I told her that wasn't the point. She said she knew. Sentencing day was the second Tuesday in January. Carol came with me this time. She had asked to come, and I hadn't argued. We sat in the second row, close enough that I could see Dennis clearly when he turned to face the judge. The judge, a soft-spoken man named Judge Ayers, who had been on the bench for 22 years, reviewed the case record before speaking. He noted the premeditation. He noted the exploitation of a family relationship as the mechanism of access. He noted the extended period over which the fraud had continued, and he noted that the victim's cognitive vulnerability had not been an unfortunate coincidence, but a condition that the defendant had researched, assessed, and deliberately targeted. He sentenced Dennis to 5 years in state prison, minimum eligibility for parole at 30 months. Dennis didn't speak during the allocution. He had waived his right to address the court. His attorney stood beside him, and when the judge finished and the gavel came down, Dennis was remanded immediately. He was let out through the side door, and he didn't look at us. I don't know whether that was shame or strategy or something else entirely. I have stopped trying to determine which. Pamela received 18 months, suspended to supervised probation with mandatory restitution payments in exchange for her full cooperation. She left the courthouse through a different exit. That evening, Carol and I drove home through the January dark, and she held my hand the way she had held it for nearly 4 decades, her fingers warm against mine, and neither of us said much until we were inside and the lights were on. She asked me if I was relieved. I thought about it honestly. I told her I was mostly tired. She said she understood that. She said she felt the same way, and also something else she wasn't sure she had a word for. Not happy exactly. More like settled. Like something that had been unbalanced for a long time had found a level surface again. We updated our estate documents the following week. Gerald Watkins, our attorney, redrafted everything with language that explicitly excluded Dennis from any provision, contingent or otherwise, and included a no-contest clause that would strip any challenger of standing if they disputed the documents in court. Carol sat beside me when I signed, her hand on the table near mine, present for every word. The following months settled into a new kind of ordinary. Carol's condition progressed slowly, as Dr. Patel had said it would, and we built routines around it. Morning walks, weekly dinners with our son and his family, a rhythm that gave her consistency and gave me something to hold on to. The consulting work I scaled back, declining any travel that would take me away for more than 2 nights. There were things more important than the work now, things that had always been more important, but that I'd allowed to recede while I trusted too broadly in the safety of the people around us. We heard from Dennis once. A letter came through Patricia's office, forwarded to me 6 months after his sentencing. It was 3 pages, handwritten in the careful cursive he'd learned from the same woman who'd taught me mine. He expressed regret in the way people express regret when what they mean is that they're sorry about the consequences rather than the act itself. He asked if there was any possibility of conversation, any path back towards something like family. He said the word family 4 times in 3 pages. I read it in my study, and then I read it again, and I put it in the filing cabinet where I kept the case documents, and I did not respond. There was nothing to say that would be honest and also kind, and I had spent enough of my professional life saying difficult things in courtrooms that I didn't feel the need to say this one in a letter. Carol never asked about him again. I don't know whether that was wisdom or the illness taking the question from her before she could reach it. I have chosen to believe it was wisdom. One afternoon in the spring, my son came over for dinner, and afterward, when Carol had gone to bed early and we were sitting on the back porch with the lights of the neighborhood laid out below us, he asked me if I regretted pursuing it the way I had. Pursuing all of it, the lawsuit and the criminal charges, all the way to sentencing. I thought about the text message Dennis had sent from the bank parking lot. She doesn't really know what she's signing. I thought about Carol's voice on the night I'd told her what had happened. I should have waited for you. I thought about 31 years of fraud investigations and the particular quality of the evidence in this case, clear and cold and deliberate, the kind that doesn't leave room for interpretation. I told my son that I had done what the situation required, that protecting someone you love isn't something you calibrate based on who the threat comes from, that the relationship makes the betrayal more serious, not less. He was quiet for a while. Then he said he was proud of me, which was not something he said easily, and I appreciated it in the way you appreciate things that are given without performance. The street below was quiet. Somewhere down the block a dog barked once, and then stopped. Carol was asleep inside. The spring air was warm the way it gets in Nashville before the summer arrives and makes everyone patient for autumn again. I had fought for my wife in the only way I knew how to fight, methodically and completely and without stopping. I would make the same choices again, every one of them, starting with the moment I pulled off the highway and listened to a stranger's voicemail that told me to come home. That was enough. That would always be enough. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Phantom Vengeance. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for being here.